Hello, I'm Grandin Gill, and I'm a professor at the University of South Florida's Muma College of Business. This is the second lecture in a series of lectures that look at how complexity and information technology impacts strategic decision making. In this lecture, we're going to look at some of the more common models used in business strategy. The models that we'll be looking at generally fall into three broad categories. The first is models that look at present versus future trade-offs. The second involves portfolios of activity trying to create a balance between risk and certainty. And then finally, models that relate to commonly observed patterns in competition. Before we get into the models themselves, however, let's take a look at some of the key theory that underlies these models. The first piece of theory that underlies a lot of these models is based upon something we discussed in the first lecture in this series, that experienced complexity, which is to say the amount of attention and effort it takes to do a task, tends to decline with repeated performance of that task. This phenomenon of performance improving with experience is actually quite general and applies to organizations as well as to individuals. This was first described in the aircraft industry, where they discovered that every time they doubled their output from the previous mark, their performance improved by a certain percentage. This actually produces a log-log relationship referred to as the learning curve, and essentially, each time the number of repetitions doubles, you get a decline, a certain percentage decline in the time it takes to perform. If you look closely at this curve looks very much like another curve that we talked about in the first lecture, which is the curve describing power law behaviors. And in fact, there have been some articles showing how the learning curve actually does naturally fall into the same type of power law relationship that is so common in complex systems. At any rate, the learning curve produces a huge advantage to things like market share because it allows you to increase the number of units that you're producing very rapidly, thereby giving you a performance advantage over competitors who are producing smaller number of units. Another piece of theory that comes from our first lecture involves the behavior of extrinsically complex landscapes that we've referred to as rugged landscapes over time, and the notion that the behavior is not randomness around a sort of general trend line, but rather involves punctuated equilibrium. Essentially, that processes will proceed in an orderly manner for a certain period and then suddenly change to another type of behavior, and that you can't really predict when these changes will occur. And so one of the challenges, if you want to predict the future, is the discontinuities can totally wreck your prediction. And we've seen that just recently with the coronavirus disruption, because it has totally changed all the predictions relating to the stock market and to the economy. This discontinuous behavior has some important implications for our ability to reduce uncertainty. What it means is when we're in an orderly period, if we're looking at the very short term, there's a very good chance that we can reduce uncertainty through the analysis that we perform. Over time, however, the impact of these discontinuities, which simply cannot be predicted, becomes larger and larger. And you finally reach a point in the long term where no amount of analysis in the short run will give us much insight into what the long run behavior is going to be. This is one of the reasons why individuals like venture capitalists tend to get very suspicious of 5-year and 10-year projections. They're useful in a sense of determining if the market is potentially large enough to accommodate a product or a new innovation. But things like predicting market share or other behaviors out beyond a few quarters become more and more subject to the discontinuities of the marketplace, and therefore are very, very uncertain. And no amount of analysis is going to reduce that uncertainty. This has some important implications for decision making, which we'll talk about when we look at individual decision making in the 4th lecture. The final bit of theory coming from the first lecture is this notion of ruggedness versus decomposability, all falling under the heading of extrinsic complexity. And just to review, when we're talking about decomposable systems, then the attributes of the system contribute to fitness in a predictable and generalizable way. You tend to get one peak, just as if you've got a multiple choice test, the peak is getting every question right. But each question contributes to your score in a predictable way. In a rugged environment, you have lots and lots of peaks because the elements of your system interact with each other. And the analogy we used was that of a recipe. If you look at a cookbook, it's a mapping of ingredients to particular combinations, and each recipe represents what the author viewed as a fitness peak, a peak where no incremental change to that recipe will actually make it better. In highly complex environments, you have lots and lots of these peaks. And what that means is that little changes can have a big impact. Once you find a peak, you tend to cling to it. And when you shift between peaks, you tend to move very, very quickly so you don't get caught in the valley in between, as suggested by this illustration here. With that theory in mind, let's take a look at our first set of strategy models that are built around the trade-offs between the present and the future. One of the best known strategy models is the Boston Consulting Group's Growth-Share model. And the basic idea of this model is as follows. There are 2 dimensions to it. There's the dimension of market share, which can be either high or low in this 2x2 model. And then there's industry growth, which is also high or low. Now, the basic idea behind this model is the future is based upon this industry growth. The present is based upon your market share. Now, growth is expensive. And so, as a consequence, if you have high growth and low market share, your costs are going to be higher than those of your competitors, and you're going to be hemorrhaging cash. On the other hand, if you have low growth and high market share, you're going to be printing money in a sense. You're in the cash cow quadrant based upon the learning curve. And so your costs will be lower than those of your competitor. And because you're not growing very quickly, it's not eating up your cash. Obviously, the best place to be is the high growth and high market share quadrant, which is referred to as the star quadrant. In that quadrant, what you would expect is that your market share will generate enough cash to support that high growth rate. Obviously, the worst place to be is the low growth, low market share, where you are basically not making any money because your costs are too high and your prospects aren't that good because your competitors are learning at a faster rate than you are, and that would be called the dog quadrant. So it's a very simple model, but it's one that has been used extensively in competitive analysis and strategy. Our second model is the familiar Porter's Five Forces model. And this model basically looks at the potential of a particular industry to generate oversized profits. And the first force is the intensity of industry rivalry. And obviously, if you've got very strong competitors, then it's going to be much harder to maintain a substantial margin. If the industry rivalry is not terribly strong, then it's much, much easier to have high profits, and everyone will sort of accept that. Now, when we start looking at the future, there are a number of different forces which could impact your competitive position. The threat of substitution. If it's possible for a substitute product to compete with you, then that's going to limit your ability to make large margins on whatever products you're selling. One of the things that kept sugar prices under control in the 1970s was the development of high fructose corn syrup 55, which could act as a substitute for sugar within soft drinks. That made it much, much harder for sugar producers to maintain high levels of prices. And part of what caused that to happen was a big price spike in sugar in the mid-70s, when it went from like 6 cents a pound to 60 cents a pound during a 6-week period. Another example of a forward-looking force is the threat of new entrants. If an industry has very strong barrier to entry, then it is very easy to maintain high margins. On the other hand, if an industry has very low barriers to entry, then it's very hard to maintain the high margins, because as soon as you do, competitors will come in. Sometimes industries use the government as a way of creating barriers to entry. So, for example, in the state of Florida, it takes almost a year of training, or maybe more than a year of training, if you want to braid people's hair. That creates a huge barrier to entry to new people entering that business, and that allows existing hair braiders to charge higher prices. Two other sources of forces on the industry include the power of suppliers. If you have very powerful suppliers, then it is going to be very hard for you to have a large profit. In the computer industry, for example, there is a very limited set of producers of semiconductors, and so as a consequence, the semiconductor industry can take a look at the margins of computer producers, and if those margins start getting large, then they can raise the prices of the components going in. Customer power is another example of something that can impact the attractiveness of the industry. Anyone who's done business with Walmart knows that Walmart is an extremely tough negotiator and will look for terms that are far better than a company's other customers might get. But because Walmart is such a large competitor and can mean so many sales, it's often worth it to sell to them, even though they squeeze your margins. So once again, this particular model can be framed in terms of the short-term and long-term forces. Another commonly used tool for strategic analysis is SWOT analysis, where SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, SWOT analysis is normally presented in terms of internal and external forces, but I would argue that you can also look at SWOT in terms of present versus future forces, as opposed to internal versus external. So, if we look at the present, our strengths are what we're currently good at. Our weaknesses are what we're currently bad at. If we look at the future, opportunities are things that we can exploit in the future. Threats are things that could cause problems for us in the future. So when you're doing a SWOT analysis, what you really are doing is looking at present and future, good and bad. The final tool I'll introduce in this present versus future segment is the balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard basically argues there's a mistake to judge a company simply by its financial performance, things like stock price and earnings per share, but instead you need to take a broader view. And the scorecard consists of scoring the company on financial metrics, on internal business perspective, this is operational metrics, on the perspective of the customers, and on the perspective of whether the firm is able to innovate and learn from its environment. So when you take this exhibit, which was drawn right out of Kaplan's article, one of the things you will notice is the financial perspective and the operational perspective both look at the organization in terms of the present, whereas the learning perspective and the perspective of customers really focuses on the organization's future prospects. So once again, we've got a strategy-related model that divides the world into what's going on in the present and what things look like in the future. The second category of strategic models that we'll look at involves creating portfolios of activities. Activity portfolios are created to solve a specific problem. As we have discussed, under high extrinsic complexity environments, we're going to have this punctuated equilibrium where behaviors change, the rules change, but we can't predict when that is going to happen. We have black swan and gray swan events that can radically impact our environment, but again, we can't predict when they're going to happen. It's the efficiency versus adaptability trade-off that we talked about in the previous lecture. So, in a rugged landscape environment, there are just too many possible peaks to understand each one of them, and changes to the environment can dramatically change whether a particular position makes sense or doesn't make sense. So, if we're going to address environments like that, one of the things that we need to do is diversify in a way that makes us more resilient to changes in the environment without eliminating the possibility of profitability through efficient systems. An example of a portfolio model that looks a lot like the BCG Matrix, but is actually has different axes, is the sales versus contribution model. And in this particular model, what we're looking at is sales on one axis. Are they a high percentage of sales or a low percentage of sales? This normally is applied to products within an organization's portfolio. And then the second axis is the contribution. Do we make a lot of money on each sale, or do we make a little money on each sale? So in this particular model, low contribution and high sales are referred to as the plow horse. High contribution, high sales are the star, just like in the BCG model. Low contribution, low sales are the dogs. And then high contribution and low sales is the problem child area. How would you apply a matrix like this? Well, one of the ways involves what is called menu engineering. If you think of a menu, where you place items on the menu is very important because if a customer can't see an item, the customer is unlikely to buy it. So, using the menu engineering model, one of the things that you would do is you would place your plow horses in a place that is somewhat difficult to find. Why? Because if someone really wants to order the plow horse, they will look for it. I've recently seen that at a McDonald's. I actually like the standard 89-cent McDonald's hamburger, and it's very, very difficult to find it on the menu because that's not what they're hoping that I will buy, because that is a relatively low margin product. Similarly, they don't have to highlight where the French fries are because people will look for it. On the other hand, if you've got a problem child, that would be an example of something who you want to beef up the sales on. You want to increase its sales amount because its contribution is very high. So that would be the type of thing you'd feature in the central menu. Maybe you'd make it a special. Your stars you want to give a prominent position to. And your dogs, eventually you want to rotate those off the menu so you don't give them a lot of visibility on the menu. Now, you might say, well, why not just get rid of dogs? Well, you can't get rid of all the dogs because the way it's computed, each quadrant represents the average. And so as a consequence, you're always going to have some items that are below average in sales and below average in contribution. But it is those items that you will remove the next time you update your menu. And one of the things that restaurant business has found is that if you do not update your menus and update your themes on a regular basis, your customers will get tired of them and you will lose those customers. Another example where portfolio theory is used in strategy is project portfolios. And this is particularly common with respect to information technology projects. And here what you have is two dimensions. The timing of the return on the project, which can be short-term or long-term, and the level of uncertainty associated with the project, which can be high or low. Now, two of these quadrants are usually the most common trade-off. For example, the safe bet is one that has a low uncertainty over the short term. Remember that over the short term, you can often assume that the environment is going to continue to behave in an orderly way with a pretty high level of confidence. You can never have 100% confidence, but the closer in you look, the greater the likelihood the environment will not go into a discontinuity. Against this, you need to have the long shots where you're talking about high potential return over the long term, so high uncertainty and over the long term. And the problem with long shots is that you can never be absolutely sure about them. But if you don't have any long shots in your portfolio, then when the environment does turn, your safe bets will no longer be safe and you'll be left without anything. Now, there's another quadrant potentially. I call it the roll the dice quadrant. These names are mine more than anyone else's, where you take a high uncertainty in the short term. Legend has it that when Federal Express was first getting started, they were almost out of money and decided to fly to Las Vegas and make bets so that they could make payroll. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that would be an example of a roll the dice strategy, actually quite literally a roll the dice strategy, and it might be something that is done occasionally, but if you do this particular strategy too often, you are not going to stay in business very long. Now, you'll notice I label one quadrant the delusion quadrant. And this is basically projects where you've got a very low uncertainty level that are really long-term projects. And I would argue if you allow yourself to think in those terms, something you're planning for the long term is in fact low uncertainty, then you are in a sense delusional, because by the time you get to the long term in a complex environment, there is a very good chance you will have experienced one or more discontinuities that have totally changed the nature of the environment, meaning that the uncertainty level is not low. A good example of a portfolio theory applied in action is Google's 70-20-10 rule. And what this rule said was for people in engineering at Google, 70% of their time needed to be spent on Google's core business, something related to search. Another 20% of their time would be spent on extensions to the core business. And then finally, 10% of their project time would be spent on activities chosen by the engineer that were fundamentally different from the core business. And things like Gmail were developed using this process. What you'll notice is by specifying percentages of the portfolio, what you do is you force managers to devote a certain amount of time to activities that may be outside of their comfort zone. That was why the information technology portfolios became popular, because managers did not want to take on high-risk projects because they felt the penalty for failing was a lot greater than the reward they'd get for succeeding. But by judging them on their ability to come up with a certain percentage of high-risk, high-payoff projects, it forced the managers to take risks even when they did not necessarily want to, by virtue of their perception of the reward system or by virtue of their personality. Another example of a portfolio-based approach is the value chain and the notion of core competence. And the basic theory that is frequently taught in MBA programs is that you could focus your efforts on your core competencies and outsource those activities that fall outside of your core competencies. This is clearly a portfolio approach based upon the learning curve, which is to say you choose a portfolio of activities that you're very good at, but it also assumes that what you're very good at now is going to be something that is a good fit with the future. In an extrinsically complex environment, that is not a given. And as a consequence, there is a risk that at some point, limiting yourself to what you're good at is going to cause problems and a lack of fit with the environment in the future. And one of the things that we're seeing nowadays is the disruption of the supply chain, once again caused by the coronavirus, that organizations are having a tough time getting it back under control precisely because they've outsourced all these things that they felt could be done better in places like China. The other danger of the core competency approach, which is a very present-focused approach, is it does not pay a lot of attention to the organization's ability to adapt and to learn. This can allow for very, very efficient organizational performance in the short run, but it creates a substantial risk for the future in the long run, and we're seeing that risk and its consequences come to pass today. The bottom line of all this being that when you look at strategy, do not engage in a strategy that inhibits your ability to adapt, because in today's global world, we can expect major shocks to occur in the future, and the organizations that survive those shocks will be the ones that are adaptable. The final set of models that we'll look at involve what I call patterns of competition, which is to say, specific patterns that emerge over time or that appear in the steady state that exist in competitive environments. Although Porter is most commonly referenced for his 5 forces model, if you actually read his books, the principal thrust involves the notion that there are certain generic strategies, and you can really look at these as peaks on a fitness landscape. What he argues is that you can have a broad or narrow competitive scope, and you can compete based on cost or differentiation. And so if you've got a broad scope and lower cost, you're in the cost leadership area. If you are a differentiated product and you are narrow in your focus, you have the differentiation focus quadrant. What Porter argues is that you need to choose your quadrant and apply the rules associated with that quadrant. And what you do not want to do is get caught in the middle, where you do not have a clear quadrant, where you try to differentiate a little bit, but you also want cost leadership, because he believes that those strategies that exist in the middle are not sustainable. So you can think of each one of these quadrants as having a fitness peak. If you're in a lower cost quadrant, then you're going to be focused on gaining market share, because the learning curve will provide you with continued cost leadership. If you're in a differentiation quadrant, however, you're going to be focused on meeting the needs of a broad set of customers who are less cost sensitive. A good example of an organization in the differentiation quadrant is Apple. Whereas the PC manufacturers focused for a long time on just getting PCs out cheaper and cheaper. So this is an interesting model, and it essentially involves both the notion of the fitness landscape and of the learning curve, and combines them. The informing transition model isn't really a strategy model. Rather, it's a model that I developed for the transdisciplinary study informing science. But it's a prelude to understanding another very important strategy model, the Innovator's dilemma. And the basic idea is that if you want an organization or an individual to move from one fitness peak to another fitness peak, in other words, make that transition we talked about, there are a number of things that have to happen. First off, we have to reduce the experience complexity, the uncertainty associated with the objective. We have to make the individual organization confident that the objective is a better fitness peak than the one they're currently on. The second thing we have to do is reduce the extrinsic complexity of that potential peak, and that goes hand in hand with reducing the uncertainty associated with it. We have to make sure the target we're looking for is sensible. Finally, we have to identify the specific path that we're going to take to move between our existing peak and our future peak as quickly as possible, because remember, between any two peaks you've got a valley, and you want to get through that valley as quickly as possible. And that essentially involves mapping out a path, which is an example of intrinsic complexity. So remember, organizations and individuals will tend to cling to peak until they have another clear peak in mind and a clear pathway to move to that peak. And that context will help explain the next model we're talking about. One of the most important pattern of competition strategy models that has emerged over the last 30 years was developed by the late Clayton Christensen and is known as the Innovator's Dilemma. It's a somewhat complex model to explain, but the basic idea is when a new innovation comes out, it attracts a certain set of customers, and it operates at a certain price, which is normally high to start out with, and a certain set of capabilities. Now, over time, through the learning curve, which you've already talked about, gradually the price will come down and the capabilities will increase. Once it reaches a certain point, you will have early adopters buying into the model. Then you'll get the mid-range adopters and the late adopters, and all of these customers will build their demand around this high set of capabilities and will generally be extremely pleased with the fact that the price of this product or service is coming down over time, albeit not that fast. Now, from time to time, particularly in technology environments, you will end up coming up with a totally different way of performing the task. And very often, when this new way comes in, it operates at a much lower set of capabilities, but also a much lower price than the original innovation. As a consequence, the customers of the original innovation are not really interested in it. They're going to be telling the company that is the original innovator, no, you're doing exactly what we want. Don't change a thing. That other technology or that other product is just a toy. So what will happen is, as the disruptive technology comes down in price and improves in capabilities, it will develop its own set of early adopters and late adopters who are attracted by the fact that the technology offers capabilities that were never possible in the past. This is all well and good, but if these customers end up producing a lot more volume, then this disruptive technology is going to move through the learning curve faster than this original, more high-priced technology. There will come a point in time where the capabilities of the disruptive technology actually exceed the capabilities of the original innovation, and at a much lower price. At this point, you can literally have a cascade in which the customers all immediately move to that new technology. A really good example of where we saw that was around 1989, 1990 in the world of mini computers. It used to be that when IBM and Apple introduced their first computers, they were viewed as toys by the mainframe community. What was not a toy was mini computers created by companies like Digital Equipment Corporation. Now, during the period of the 1980s, millions and millions of these PCs were sold, and they were advancing in capabilities at a very, very rapid rate. What started to happen was, as companies like Intel had huge volumes for their processors, through the learning curve and through Moore's law, the capabilities of these microcomputers improved at a faster rate than those of the mini computers manufactured by companies like Digital Equipment. Around 1989, 1990, the microcomputers exceeded the capability of the mini computers of Digital Equipment Corporation, and almost immediately all of Digital's customers jumped ships and started accomplishing tasks with PCs that had originally required the VAX computers or the PDP computers that were manufactured by DET. And it was really a remarkable transition because while I was working on my dissertation in the late 1980s, Digital Equipment was considered to be, the future. Everyone thought that IBM was dead. Everyone thought that PCs were toys. And Digital Equipment was this sweet spot. And in fact, whenever they wanted two IBM mainframes to talk with each other, they would frequently put a Digital Equipment VAX computer between the two of them. But it all changed when the PC's capabilities reached the point where they exceeded that of the digital computers at a much, much lower price, usually a factor of 4 or 5 times lower. Wikipedia actually had a rather nice graphic illustrating the progress of the disruptive technology and how it takes away customers. What you find is that disruptive technology typically first captures your low and medium use customers and then gradually moves up to the most demanding use customers because it has a faster learning curve than the original innovation had. When Clayton Christensen presented the Innovator's Dilemma, one of the examples he uses is much less technical than the computer example, but shows the dangers of complacency. And what it involved was the introduction of what were called mini mills in the U.S. steel industry. So traditionally, steel has been made in large integrated facilities, facilities that are often a mile long, where iron ore goes in and is refined and heated, and basically by the time it comes out, at the other end, you've got high quality steel. Now, mini mills are very different. First off, they don't cost $1 billion or whatever to build. They can operate at a much smaller scale, and typically their input would be scrap steel or scrap iron. So mini mills were relatively cheap to operate, and there was plenty of scrap iron around. And so when they were introduced into the country, there were still a number of these large integrated mills that were in operation. The first thing mini mills did was produce a very low quality of steel. That particular type of steel is used in rebar. When your steel is going to be used to essentially make concrete much stronger, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if it's got any defects. Basically, the people who are buying rebar just care that it's good enough. And so the mini mills were able to make rebar at a slightly lower price than the large integrated mills. Now, when the integrated mills saw this happening, they looked at their income statements and balance sheets, and one of the things they saw is they were making much less money on rebar than they were on the other products they were selling. So, in fact, when the mini mills started biting into their rebar market, it actually made their margins look better. So rather than being angry about that, their attitude was, well, this is great. Now we don't have to make this stupid rebar, and we'll show greater profitability. Now, as the mini mills gained experiences and the technology improved, they moved up to the next level, which is sort of angle iron, the stuff that's used for girders and that sort of thing. Once again, the integrated steel producers looked at this and said, well, now we don't have to focus on angle iron anymore, which is taking down our profits, because where we make the real money is in sheet steel, the finished product used for cars and things like that. And so, once again, they did not compete very hard against the mini mills because the mini mills were taking away something that they didn't really want to make that much anyway. The problem is the mini mill technology advanced to the next level, at which they started to make sheet steel at the same quality level as the integrated mills at a lower price. And what that ended up doing was shutting down the integrated steel mills pretty much throughout the U.S. The only place where these mills could compete was places that were very near large sources of iron ore and large sources of coal that could become coke that was used in that process. And there just weren't that many locations in the U.S. that fit the bill and had low labor costs. And so that part of the steel industry died in the U.S. And was replaced by these mini mills. Not a very high-tech technology, but one that succeeded in disrupting an industry that for many years was viewed as absolutely critical to the U.S. Well, that concludes our second lecture where we looked at strategy models and their relationship to complexity. In the third and fourth lectures, what we'll be looking at is the impact of information technology and complexity on organizations, and then the impact of IT and complexity on the individual. Our fifth lecture will then look at some of the ways that we may be able to address these high complexity environments. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me, grandon@usf.edu. That is GRANDON @usf.edu. Thank you very much.